March 10, 1945. The night sky over Tokyo burned like a furnace. The city had been transformed into a sea of fire by American bombers, wooden houses collapsing in showers of sparks, mothers clutching their children as the air itself seemed to ignite. On the ground, in the shadows beyond the smoke, a quieter march was taking place. Rows of women stumbling forward under guard, shoeless, thin, their eyes dulled by years of humiliation. Some had been dragged from villages in Korea, others from occupied China, and a few from the poorer quarters of Japan itself. They were comfort women, a term that sounded gentle, almost polite, but concealed a system of industrialized abuse. For them, capture by the enemy should have meant death. Yet each step forward brought them closer not to annihilation, but to something stranger and far more unsettling: kindness. The road that led them here had been carved in cruelty. Recruitment often began with promises: work in factories, jobs in kitchens, even the lure of becoming nurses for the Imperial Army. What many discovered instead were locked doors, barred windows, and the smell of disinfectant in rooms that would become their prisons. The Japanese military brothels, known as ianjo, were scattered across Asia like way stations of despair. Within those walls, women endured the endless parade of soldiers, sometimes 20 or more in a single day. Beatings were common, food scarce, medical care perfunctory at best. Some carried children they never chose, others lost the ability to bear them at all. Many did not survive. Those who did often described their lives not in years, but in nights, counted one by one, each indistinguishable from the last. One Korean girl, barely 16, later recalled how she had memorized the sound of boots on gravel. That rhythm told her how many minutes remained before another soldier pushed through the curtain. Another woman, taken from a fishing village in the Philippines, remembered the smell of seaweed still clinging to her clothes the day she was taken. In the brothel, that memory became her anchor, a way to pretend she was still human while her body was treated as anything but. The Japanese officers, sworn to honor the emperor, rarely spared these women even a word. To them, the women were not people, they were supplies. By 1945, with the empire collapsing and allied forces pressing in from every side, the comfort stations began to empty. Some women were abandoned outright, left to starve as garrisons retreated. Others were forced to march alongside soldiers, treated as burdens yet still denied their freedom. Those caught in the path of advancing Americans braced for the worst. They had been told that Americans were devils, merciless and depraved, eager to slaughter or violate any woman who fell into their hands. After years of abuse by their own army, it was not hard to believe that even worse awaited them across enemy lines. The day of capture often began like any other: a dawn mist, the smell of burning villages in the distance, the sharp orders of Japanese officers. But when gunfire erupted and surrender followed, the guards who once held absolute power over them suddenly became powerless themselves. The women watched as rifles clattered to the ground, as white flags rose trembling in the smoke. American soldiers advanced with weapons ready, scanning the horizon for danger. For the women, time seemed to freeze. They did not know whether to flee, beg, or simply close their eyes and wait. One testimony describes that moment with startling clarity. A woman from Manchuria remembered hiding her face with her hands as American boots stopped inches from her. She waited for the strike, the shove, the order. Instead, a soldier lowered his rifle and gestured toward a truck filled with supplies. He spoke words she could not understand, but his tone carried no malice. Another survivor recalled the surreal sight of a guard offering her a cigarette, then quickly realizing she did not smoke and producing instead a piece of chocolate from his pack. "I had forgotten sweetness existed," she said years later, her voice breaking. Yet relief did not come instantly. The women, conditioned by years of violence, distrusted every gesture. They flinched at kindness, expecting cruelty to follow. At night, some lay awake waiting for footsteps, convinced that the assaults would begin anew. But the footsteps never came. Instead, meals arrived at regular hours. Medical staff inspected wounds. Guards kept their distance, sometimes awkwardly polite, as though unsure how to approach without frightening them further. For women who had been property, this sudden recognition of their humanity was almost unbearable. It was easier, in some ways, to endure cruelty than to accept compassion after so long without it. Still, hunger eventually overpowered fear. When bowls of rice were passed through the barbed wire, Trembling hands reached out. The food was warm, steaming, real. It was not scraps thrown like bait, but full portions measured with care. Some women wept into their meals, the taste of simple grains unlocking memories of childhood kitchens. A Filipino survivor once said the smell of boiled rice in an American camp nearly undid her. It was the same scent her mother had carried in her clothes, years before soldiers tore her from her village. As the days stretched into weeks, the women's bodies began to change. Sunken cheeks filled slightly, fevers eased, eyes regained their light. Yet beneath the surface lay a raw, unspoken question. Why? Why would enemies show them mercy when their own army had denied them even dignity? The irony was almost too bitter to bear. To call a prison paradise felt absurd, but the comparison was inescapable. Behind the barbed wire, with food in their bellies and nights free from intrusion, they were living better than they had in the so-called service of their nation. One Japanese woman, captured near Okinawa, put it simply in an oral history decades later. We expected death. Instead, we were treated like people. That was paradise enough. Her words, delivered in a trembling whisper, carry the weight of all who shared that road. The march that began under flames and fear ended in something stranger than freedom. It ended in safety. But safety was not peace. Each woman carried wounds that no camp could heal, memories that no kindness could erase. And even as they began to breathe more easily, to taste food without choking on tears, a shadow lingered. What would happen when the war truly ended? Where would they go, and who would accept them? The answer, when it came, would not be simple. For the moment, they lived in the contradiction of captivity that felt freer than their years of so-called service. The Americans had not killed them. They had not touched them. They had fed them, clothed them, treated them. And that was enough to call it paradise, for now. Yet just beyond the barbed wire, the ruins of Japan smoldered, and the world that awaited them outside was not ready to welcome them home. The first night behind the barbed wire was filled with silence that felt heavier than gunfire. The women huddled together, their bodies taut with suspicion, ears straining for footsteps in the dark. 4 years, night had meant intrusion. They expected the creak of a door, the rasp of boots, the weight of another man's shadow. But the silence held. The guards on watch stood at a distance, rifles slung casually, smoking cigarettes under the faint glow of lanterns. Nothing happened. The quiet was so unfamiliar that some women wept, not from fear, but from a fragile relief they did not yet dare to trust. At dawn, they learned the new rhythm of the camps. An American bugle pierced the air, its brassy call strange to their ears, but it carried no order for them. The women rose slowly, bracing for shouts or blows. Instead, a soldier approached carrying a metal pot that steamed in the cold morning. He set it down without ceremony and stepped back. The smell of rice drifted upward. Real rice, polished and white, mixed with bits of dried fish. A few women gasped aloud. In the brothels, food had been meager, scraps of barley, moldy bread, sometimes nothing at all. Here, the bowls were filled to the brim. For a long moment, no one touched the food. They suspected a trick, some cruel prelude to humiliation. Only when the guards waved them on did they begin to eat. The taste was overwhelming in its simplicity. Grain, salt, the faint smokiness of fish, it was enough to remind them they were still alive. The Americans seemed almost awkward in their presence. Reports from the U.S. Army's military police later recorded that female prisoners were treated under strict regulation, with explicit orders forbidding physical contact. For the women, accustomed to violence, the absence of intrusion was so startling it felt unreal. Guards patrolled, but with a detachment that was almost courteous. Some tipped their helmets when passing, an unconscious habit carried over from civilian life. One survivor later joked that the soldiers treated them less like prisoners and more like strangers on a train, distant, polite, occasionally curious but never overstepping. Medical care was the next shock. Within days, a tent was erected and staffed with army medics. They examined wounds, treated infections, dispensed sulfa powder for sores. One Korean woman recalled the trembling in her hands as a young medic cleaned the deep gash on her leg. She waited for the sting of insult, the sneer she had known so well from Japanese doctors. But the man said nothing cruel. He only nodded, murmured something in English, and bound her leg with clean gauze. She remembered staring at his hands. Large, clumsy, but careful. That simple act of attention felt like a form of salvation. Still, suspicion lingered. Many women whispered at night, convinced that the Americans were waiting for the right moment to strip away the illusion of safety. One rumor claimed they would be shipped across the ocean and displayed as trophies. Another insisted that the chocolate bars some soldiers handed out must be poisoned. Fear clung like smoke, impossible to banish with a single meal or bandage. Trust, after years of betrayal, was a foreign language. And yet, little by little, gestures accumulated. When a soldier noticed a woman struggling to carry water, he lifted the bucket himself. When another group sat shivering in thin rags, surplus blankets appeared. Even the Red Cross arrived with parcels: soap, canned fruit, powdered milk. The women had forgotten what oranges smelled like, and the sharp citrus tang was enough to draw laughter from lips that had forgotten how. For the first time in years, some of them smiled openly, though the smiles carried the weight of disbelief. The camp itself was no paradise, at least not by ordinary standards. The barbed wire cut into the sky like jagged scars. The ground turned to mud in the rain, clinging to their feet and staining the hems of their clothes. Latrines were crude, privacy scarce, and sickness lingered in the damp air. But compared to the brothels, to the long nights of forced submission, the camp was a sanctuary. The contrast was so sharp it felt almost cruel. To find safety in a prison was to realize just how profoundly their dignity had been stolen before. Numbers tell part of the story. American records show that daily rations for prisoners often included between 2,500 and 3,000 calories, more than many Japanese civilians outside the camps received as the war collapsed. Mortality rates in U.S.-run camps were drastically lower than in Japanese-run facilities, where prisoners often starved to death. To the women, these figures were not abstractions but living proof. Their cheeks filled out, fevers broke, bones stopped protruding so sharply against skin. Survival, which had once been an hour-by-hour calculation, now stretched into days and weeks with a rhythm they could almost believe in. Amid these changes, fragments of personality resurfaced. One woman began to sing quietly at night, lullabies from her childhood. Another scavenged scraps of cloth and fashioned crude dolls for the younger girls, who clutched them like treasures. A few dared to trade words with the guards, piecing together fragments of English: hello, thank you, good. Some soldiers, in turn, tried to mimic Korean or Japanese greetings, usually mangling them so badly that both sides burst into nervous laughter. That laughter was a fragile bridge, proof that even in the ruins of war, humanity could reach across language and pain. The irony was inescapable. They were captives of the enemy, and yet for the first time in years, their bodies were their own. A Korean survivor put it bitterly: "I had to be a prisoner to remember I was a person." The phrase spread among them, repeated in whispers, half in anger, half in wonder. For some, the camp became a place to imagine futures again, not grand ones, just small dreams: a home, a meal with family, a day without fear. But not all could accept the shift. A few women, broken beyond repair, refused food, convinced it was another form of control. Others fell into silence, unable to reconcile kindness with the memories carved into their skin. Healing was uneven, jagged, unpredictable. What they shared was the unshakable realization that their suffering had not been inevitable. It had been inflicted, deliberately, by those who should have protected them. That knowledge sat heavier than the wire fences. There were moments of dark humor that lightened the weight. The first time Spam appeared on their plates, most women stared at the pink slab with suspicion. Some poked it with chopsticks, convinced it was soap. One brave soul took a bite and grimaced so theatrically that laughter rippled across the group. Days later, that same woman was sneaking extra pieces from the mess line. "We survived the Emperor," she teased, "and now we survive Spam." It became a running joke, a strange emblem of survival. The Americans themselves seemed both bewildered and cautious. For many soldiers, this was their first time encountering women who were not simply civilians but victims of their own supposed allies. Some scribbled notes in letters home, describing Japanese girls who were not quite prisoners, not quite refugees. A few guards admitted later that they avoided eye contact, afraid their presence alone might reopen wounds. That restraint, awkward as it was, proved to be its own form of respect. Over time, The women began to understand that their captors had no script for them. They were not targets, not laborers, not objects to be used. They were simply people caught in a war's undertow, and for once, that was enough. It was not paradise. But compared to what had come before, the word fit in its own twisted way. Still, the barbed wire remained. Beyond it lay a world in ruins, and the women knew that sooner or later they would have to leave the safety of this strange limbo. Some longed for it, others dreaded it. The irony grew sharper by the day. The only place they had found peace was inside a prison. And so each night, as lanterns flickered and silence descended once more, the women lay awake with the same thought. If this was how their enemies treated them, what awaited them when the gates finally opened and they had to face their own people again? The question lingered in the dark, heavier than hunger, sharper than wire, waiting for an answer none of them were ready to hear. They began to speak only after silence had grown too heavy. At first, the words came in fragments, half-sentences murmured under blankets, names whispered like prayers, jokes spoken nervously as if humor itself might invite punishment. But the longer they remained in the American camps, the more voices rose, weaving together a chorus of survival that had been suppressed for years. Their testimonies, fragile yet unyielding, formed a strange record of gratitude, bitterness, and irony. They spoke not because they trusted the future, but because silence had nearly killed them. One Korean woman, her body frail from untreated syphilis, recalled the first time an American doctor examined her. His face was young, almost boyish, his uniform too crisp to have seen much combat. He asked questions through an interpreter, his tone steady, professional. She braced herself for the sneer, the contempt she had known in Japanese clinics where women like her were blamed for their own infections. Instead, he gently pressed a stethoscope against her chest, his brows furrowed in concentration. "He looked at me," she later said, "as if I was a patient, not a tool." The memory haunted her, not because it was painful, but because it revealed how little dignity she had been given before. Another testimony came from a Chinese woman captured near the Philippines. She had been forced into service at 15, her body broken before it had fully grown. In the camp, when given a blanket on a cold night, she wept uncontrollably. Years later, she tried to explain the absurdity of that moment. "I cried not because of the blanket, but because I realized I had forgotten what warmth felt like when it was freely given." The detail seemed small, almost mundane, but in her story it became the symbol of everything that separated captivity under the Japanese from imprisonment under the Americans. Food, too, became part of their testimonies. Again and again, women remembered the shock of abundance. One Korean survivor laughed as she described her first bite of canned peaches. The syrup clung to her lips, sticky and golden. She had not tasted sweetness since childhood. "I thought," she said, "this is what heaven must taste like." Another remembered her confusion at powdered milk, stirred into lukewarm water by Red Cross volunteers. She found it bitter, chalky, and strange. Yet even that taste became sacred, proof that her body was no longer an afterthought. For some, irony colored every recollection. A Japanese woman from Okinawa, captured after weeks of bombardment, remarked with dark humor that she had gained more weight in 3 months of American captivity than in 3 years of serving her own army. "The emperor starved us," she said, "and the enemy made us fat." The absurdity drew laughter when she shared it decades later with researchers, but at the time, it carried a sting sharper than any joke. To live better as a prisoner than as a supposed servant of the nation was a wound that never healed. Yet testimonies were not only about kindness. Many women confessed they lived in constant fear of what might still come. Even as the Americans fed and clothed them, trust remained elusive. A Filipino survivor described nights of sleepless dread, convinced that one mistake, one wrong gesture, would shatter the illusion of safety. "It was like walking on glass," she said. "Even when no one touched us, we felt bruised." The irony of protection within fences was a theme that recurred endlessly. Safety and captivity fused in one bitter shape. Among the most poignant accounts are those of rediscovering laughter. A small group of women remembered how soldiers once distributed chewing gum, unaware that no one knew what it was. They studied the strange rubbery strips, sniffed them suspiciously, and at least one woman swallowed hers whole, thinking it food. The Americans erupted in startled laughter, but instead of mocking, they demonstrated how to chew. Soon, the women laughed too, awkward, shy, but genuine. A moment of absurdity became a spark of shared humanity. Survivors later described it as the first time in years they had laughed without punishment. Historians such as Yoshiaki Yoshimi and George Hicks recorded similar voices in their research, voices that spoke with a mixture of relief and rage. Relief that they had survived the war, rage that their own countrymen had discarded them so easily. The testimonies highlight not only the comfort women's suffering but the twisted irony of their salvation. To call an American prison paradise was less an exaggeration than a damning indictment of the horrors that came before. But not every voice spoke with hope. Some remained bitter, unable to reconcile kindness from an enemy with betrayal by their own. One Korean woman spat the words decades later, "I hated the Americans for reminding me how human I still was." For her, every meal, every clean bandage was not a gift but an accusation, proof that her suffering had never been necessary. Survival carried its own cruelty, the knowledge that her years of pain had been inflicted by choice, not by fate. There were stories, too, of the youngest survivors, girls who barely understood the language of violence that had been forced upon them. One, only 13 when she was captured, spoke later of how she had forgotten her own name, answering only to the number assigned to her in the brothel. In the American camp, a nurse asked her name again and again until she finally whispered it. The sound of her own identity spoken aloud felt foreign, like a secret rediscovered. She clung to it as though it were a lifeline. And then there were moments of sheer, bewildering irony. A handful of women described feeling safer with their enemy captors than with their fellow countrymen. One survivor recalled how Japanese soldiers, imprisoned alongside them, sometimes tried to taunt or intimidate them through the wire. The Americans intervened, keeping them apart. "The men who once owned us now sat in cages beside us," she said, "and it was the enemy who kept them away." The role reversal was almost too surreal to process. The irony extended beyond the camp's walls. As the war edged toward its end, word filtered in of Japan's surrender, of atomic fire raining down on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the women, the news stirred conflicting emotions, relief that the war was ending, dread of what awaited them beyond the fences. Some cheered softly, others wept. One testimony captured the paradox with aching clarity. When the emperor surrendered, the Americans cheered. When I heard it, I felt nothing. I was already lost. And yet, beneath every voice lay the same undercurrent, the rediscovery of humanity in the unlikeliest of places. Their stories were not about luxury or joy, but about the smallest fragments of dignity: a blanket, a bowl of rice, a hand that touched without harm. These fragments became lifelines, proof that survival was more than mere endurance. Decades later, when historians and activists collected their words, many women struggled to explain the bitter contradiction of their memories. Some described the camps as Rakuin, paradise, a word that would sound grotesque to anyone picturing barbed wire and mud. But in their mouths, it meant something else: the end of constant fear, the return of breath, the reminder that kindness still existed. Paradise, one survivor explained, is not freedom. It is the chance to sleep without crying. Their testimonies did not erase the scars. The women carried those scars home, if home would have them. Many found silence awaiting them beyond the fences, societies unwilling to acknowledge what had been done. Their voices, spoken in the camps with trembling defiance, often faded into decades of denial. Yet the memory of those days remained, a paradox etched in flesh and memory. The enemy gave them back their humanity, if only for a moment. It is this irony, sharp and enduring, that makes their testimonies more than personal recollections. They are indictments, quiet but unyielding, of a world that failed them long before the Americans opened the gates. And as they spoke, as researchers recorded, one question hovered between every word. What would happen when the fences were gone, when the women were no longer prisoners but survivors cast into a world eager to forget? The answer, like so much of their lives, would not be simple. And when liberation finally came, it brought not only release but a new kind of exile, one that would wound them in ways no prison ever could. When the gates finally opened, it did not feel like freedom. The women stepped cautiously beyond the barbed wire, blinking into a world they no longer recognized. Japan lay in ruins, cities gutted by firebombs, rail lines twisted, families scattered. Korea and China, too, were fractured, caught between the shadows of empire and the dawn of independence. For women who had lived as shadows themselves, liberation carried a weight they were unprepared to bear. Their bodies were free, but their futures were uncertain, and the silence awaiting them was sharper than any prison fence. Some were returned to their hometowns, escorted by Allied authorities or humanitarian groups, but the journeys home were fraught with dread. A Korean survivor recalled stepping off a transport ship, the smell of sea salt thick in her nose, only to feel an invisible wall of shame pressing against her. She had imagined embraces, the relief of a family who thought her dead. Instead, her parents lowered their eyes, unable to meet her gaze. "They called me ruined," she said, "and I realized I was freer in the camp than in my own village." The irony burned. Her humanity had been restored by strangers, only to be stripped away by those closest to her. Others faced even bleaker receptions. Some were married off quickly, their pasts buried in hurried ceremonies meant to erase shame. Others were shunned, accused of collaboration, treated as if they had chosen their torment. A Chinese woman remembered neighbors whispering as she passed, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. "They believed I had been a mistress to the enemy," she confessed. "How could I explain that my body had never been mine to give?" No words could untangle the complexity of what had been done to them. In societies eager to rebuild, memory became an inconvenience. The Americans had provided food, medicine, even a measure of safety, but they could not provide absolution. Once the women walked back into their homelands, the protection vanished. The Red Cross records faded into archives. The testimonies of soldiers who had seen their condition were filed away in military reports, rarely read outside official circles. What remained were the women themselves, carrying wounds invisible to the world. Many learned quickly that silence was safer than truth. To speak was to invite scorn, to reveal scars others preferred not to see. Decades later, when a handful of survivors began to tell their stories publicly, the bitterness of irony had not dulled. They remembered the camps as paradise, not because they were blind to the wire and mud, but because kindness had existed there in a form absent from their own homes. A Korean survivor put it with devastating clarity, "I slept without fear in an American prison, but I could not sleep in my own bed without shame." Such words unsettled historians and audiences alike, challenging the easy categories of victim and liberator. The enemy had given them humanity, while family and nation denied it. This conflict cut deeply into their identities. For Japanese survivors, the shame was doubled. To admit to having been a comfort woman was to acknowledge betrayal by the very nation they had once believed they served. For Koreans and Chinese, the pain was sharpened by the reality that they had been doubly oppressed, first by Japanese soldiers, then by their own community's silence. Each testimony revealed not only personal suffering but the fracture of entire societies unwilling to face what war had created. The irony became a kind of curse. A woman could recall the exact taste of canned peaches in an American camp, yet she could not speak her truth at her family's table. She could remember the way a medic wrapped her wound with gentle hands, but she could not expect gentleness from her husband, who demanded silence about her past. Every small fragment of kindness carried within it the echo of betrayal. Why had it been the enemy, not her own, who treated her as human? The legacy of this silence stretched into decades. For years, the world knew little of the comfort women beyond rumor. Governments denied, societies ignored, and survivors aged in quiet corners, their voices hushed by the weight of cultural shame. It was not until the 1990s, half a century after the war, that some began to step forward, demanding recognition, apologies, reparations. Their words cracked open the silence, revealing not only their suffering but the cruel paradox that had shaped their memories. One Korean survivor, standing before cameras in the late 20th century, spoke with trembling defiance. "I called the camp paradise. Do you know how terrible life must be, for prison to feel like heaven?" Her voice carried both rage and sorrow, echoing across decades of neglect. That testimony became a spark, igniting global awareness of the comfort women system, forcing nations to confront the crimes that had been buried. Yet even then, debates raged. Some dismissed the testimonies as exaggerations. Others accused the women of dishonoring their families by speaking. Silence, once imposed by force, now returned in the form of disbelief. And yet, the women endured. Their stories, collected by historians and activists, carried a power beyond denial. They spoke not only of suffering but of the strange mercy found in the unlikeliest place. Their words defied simple narratives of good and evil, enemy and ally. They revealed the war's deepest wound, that salvation came not from victory, but from moments of humanity too rare to endure. As the women aged, statues began to rise in their honor, bronze figures of young girls seated in quiet defiance, empty chairs beside them inviting the world to sit and remember. These memorials stood in sharp contrast to the memories of barbed wire and mud, yet they carried the same message, that silence must not be allowed to swallow truth again. The irony remained, etched in stone and bronze. The enemy had treated them as human when their own world would not. In the end, liberation was not a single moment but a lifelong struggle. The gates of the camps had opened, but the true prison lingered in memory, in shame, in the refusal of others to see. To call those camps paradise was to measure the depth of cruelty they had endured before, to name the twisted reality of a world where freedom itself could wound more deeply than captivity. And so the story does not end with release, but with a haunting truth. The war ended, but the women carried it within them until their last breath. Their testimonies, sharpened by irony and grief, remain as warnings, as indictments, as fragile monuments of survival. The paradise they remembered was no paradise at all, only a shadowed reminder of what humanity could be, and of how rarely it was given to them.